Okay, so it should be recording. So I had a couple of inquiries about whether or not this lecture would be recorded. I will make the recording available after this, and if you had any friends who maybe were interested but they had a class or they couldn't make it for some reason, you can let them know that it was recorded, and you know, they can contact me, or I'll post it to our YouTube page as well. And that's another thing that I can share the link to. The work, the Writing and Academic Resource Center, has our own YouTube channel where we have a couple of projects going on. One of them is that we record our creative writing related talks and we post them on there. So if you go there, you can see old talks given by professors at AUCA and by me. So it might be interesting to review. There's a talk on there about fiction writing. We have one by Professor Nicholas Walmsley reading his own fiction, so it should be pretty interesting. All right, so it's several minutes past the hour, so let's get started. Welcome everybody. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Erica Eisen. I'm the coordinator of the Writing and Academic Resource Center, or WORK, or WARC, however you want to call it. My colleague Maria Antonova, who is the director, is also here. So welcome, Maria. I'm glad to see you. So one of the initiatives that we have been doing for about a year and a half now, I believe, is the Creative Writing Club. And we have had talks about short stories. We've had events related to poetry, translation, but we haven't had any events related to nonfiction writing. So that is what I want to talk about today: creative nonfiction, what it is, what are some different styles, and why authors choose one style or another. So I have some slides. I'm just going to take a moment to set up screen sharing. So one moment, please. Okay, so you should be able to see some slides now, correct?
Yes.
Great. All right, so I'm going to try to put it in presentation mode and see if that doesn't mess up, because we've had some problems with it in the past. Do you still see the slides? Sorry, Miriam, I have to ask you to answer. And then if I press change slides, does it also change slides for you guys, or no?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm talking today about creative nonfiction. And the first thing to get out of the way is, what is creative nonfiction? So probably you guys have heard the term nonfiction as opposed to fiction, right? Fiction, things like novels, short stories, things that are made up. Nonfiction, things that are real. But what is creative nonfiction? What does that mean? So there is a magazine called Creative Nonfiction, a quite famous one, and the definition that they use as their motto, which I like, is good stories well told, right? So it's a good story, it's a true story, and it's told in an artistic way. So, to be a bit more concrete, a bit more detailed, creative nonfiction prioritizes the beauty of language, right? Not just what happens, but also how you describe it, and takes inspiration in this respect from other literary forms, for example, poetry or fiction writing, right? So it might be helpful to distinguish what creative nonfiction is not. So, for example, your textbooks, your history textbook, or your whatever textbook, it is nonfiction, but the priority is not on the beauty of language, right? It's not on telling the story of Russian history in a beautiful and exciting way, unfortunately. It's probably just saying, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? So textbook is probably not creative nonfiction. An instruction manual, right? Same thing. If you're reading the instructions for how to set up your computer, I don't know what I did. Sorry. You know, it's not going to, again, be anything beautiful or lovely. It's really just going to be sort of straightforward. Similarly, essays you write for class, you know, for FYS, for example. This is an academic piece of writing. You know, the focus, again, is not on, you know, how do I do this in a really linguistically artistic and poetic way. The emphasis is more on clarity of thought, you know, putting things in order, which is not to say that it can't be good writing. It's just simply a different kind of writing, right? And then press something, I don't know why I pressed. A typical news article, right? So if you're reading, you know, an economics report, it's not going to suddenly start talking about, you know, the colors in the sunset or something like that, right? It's just about the facts, right? There's no little consideration for loveliness. Whereas something like a memoir or an autobiography, or a personal essay, an essay about your own experiences with something, or what's called literary journalism, which is, for example, usually longer pieces you might see in a magazine like The New Yorker, for example. These would be things that would fall into the category of creative nonfiction. Okay, so the most basic way of telling a story is a linear way of telling the story, right? It's a line, right? First this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and finally this happened, right? That's a perfectly logical, perfectly simple way of telling a story. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to talk about a couple of alternative ways of telling a story. And I want to begin by talking about two Russian terms. Sorry, if you hear some noise in the background, it's my sister's alarm clock going off. I don't know if you can hear it, but I certainly can. So I apologize. So there was a group of Russian literary scholars called the Russian formalists, who were very influential, not only for Russian language scholarship on literature, but also English language scholarship. And they introduced into English actually two Russian words. So fabula and sujet. We also use these words in English when referring to their work. So fabula is the chronological sequence of events, right? First A, then B, then C, right? First you were born, then you grew up, then you died. You know, sad ending. Whereas the sujet is how these events are arranged, right? So let's look at an example, right? We can tell someone's life story in chronological order, right? Birth, childhood, adulthood, old age, death. In this case, the fabula and the sujet are in the exact same order, right? The events are told in the exact same order as they happened. But of course, you can tell things in many different orders, right? So you can start, but you know, none of us are old, but let's just pretend. Someone in their old age can reflect on their childhood, right? And then the narrative goes to adulthood, they get older. There's some memory triggered and they remember their childhood again. And then they go back to the adulthood part again. And they go back to the old age part. And then they go back all the way to birth. And then it continues, right? So the point I want to get across here is the simplest way of telling the story is a linear fashion, like version 1. But as writers, we should be aware that we have complete power over how to organize things in time. And we can choose not to do that in a linear fashion for various reasons, right? One simple way is maybe it's just more engaging, right? Maybe, for example, you're writing a memoir and you're very interested in the subject of memory itself. Well, of course, the human mind doesn't necessarily work as just a straight line going from one thing to the next logical thing to the next logical thing, right? You're having a thought, oh, and then that reminds you of something completely different. Oh, and then you remember that you have to go to the grocery store, and then suddenly you're thinking about your grandmother or whatever, right? So our thoughts are a bit jumbled, and sometimes writers want to mirror that effect in their writing, particularly if they are writing about memory, or they are writing, a memoir, which is basically an act of remembering their past, right? So it makes sense, right? So as well as thinking about alternative ways of ordering events, linear we talked about, and also non-linear, right? Implicitly, we can also think about how to vary what we include in a piece of nonfiction, right? So a collage, as I'm sure you know, is a type of art where you glue different kinds of things together. It comes from the French word for to glue, right? So here we have, photographs, pieces of a newspaper, it looks like, some advertisements, etc., all put together in, contrasting ways. Similarly, we can arrange a narrative with different pieces, right? We can take quotes from different things. We can take, discussions of events that occurred at very different times, discussions of very different things, and put them in, juxtapose them, right? Put them in opposition with each other to see what sort of interesting connections come out of that. So one writer who I think does a really wonderful job of this type of collage writing is a writer named Maggie Nelson. She writes a lot about art. She also writes about her own life, often in connection with art in some way. So she wrote a book, which I recommend very strongly, called Bluets. I have a link. I'll share a link at the end to all of the excerpts that I'm sharing today. But this book, Bluets, is about her obsession with the color blue. She writes at the beginning that she is in love with the color blue. And the entire book is, as I think you can see from this page, a series of very short, numbered fragments related in some way to the color blue, to feeling blue, which is an idiom which means to feel sad, things like that. So I'm just going to read some of this, and then we can talk a little bit about the effect. Okay, so 87. Great suffering, joy, exertion is not for women. Her life should flow by more quietly, trivially, gently than the man's, without being essentially happier or unhappier, wrote Schopenhauer, the philosopher. What woman, one would like to ask, did he know? At any rate, would that it were so. 88. Like many self-help books, The Deepest Blue is full of horrifyingly simplistic language and some admittedly good advice. Somehow the women in the book all learn to say, that's my depression talking, it's not me. 89. As if we could scrape the color off the iris of the eye and still see. 90. Last night I wept in a way I haven't wept for some time. I wept until I aged myself. I watched it happen in the mirror. I watched the lines arrive around my eyes like engraved sunbursts. It was like watching flowers open in time lapse on a windowsill. The tears not only aged my face, they also changed its texture, turned the skin of my cheeks into putty. I recognized this as a rite of decadence, but I did not know how to stop it. 91. Blue eye, archaic. A blueness or dark circle around the eye from weeping or other cause. 92. Eventually, I confessed to a friend some details about my weeping, its intensity, its frequency. She says, kindly, that she thinks that we sometimes weep in front of a mirror, not to inflame self-pity, but because we want to feel witness in our own despair. Can a reflection be a witness? Can one pass oneself the sponge wet with vinegar from a reed? 93. At first glance, it seems strange to think that an innocuous inborn behavior, such as crying, could be dysfunctional or symptomatic, writes one clinical psychologist. But this psychologist insists we must face the fact that some crying is simply, quote, maladaptive, dysfunctional, or immature. 94. Well then, it is as you please. This is the dysfunction talking. This is the disease talking. This is how much I miss you talking. This is the deepest blue. Talking, always talking to you. So within these 2 pages, she's combined a couple of different things. She has a piece from her dictionary, this definition of this term blue eye. She has pieces from psychological clinician, pieces from a philosopher, her own short musings, words from her friends, all of these sorts of things. And through this, she's able to think about how our perception and our emotions are related, why we cry, the nature of depression, the nature of the color blue, all of these things through combining these disparate and yet thematically connected elements. One thing I love about Maggie Nelson's writing is that sometimes she introduces elements. She starts talking about some writer or some artist, for example, and it's not exactly clear why. And it's only much later when that artist or that writer or that philosopher or whatever comes back again, they're able to say, oh, that's why she mentioned it in the first place. She was planting a seed and now the flower is sprouting. So I think that this is a really engaging method of organizing a narrative. It's one that requires active participation on the part of a reader to assemble the elements in the mind and draw the connections, but it can be really fruitful. This is sort of collage style, as I was saying. So the next type of a narrative I want to talk about is a braided narrative. We often hear it in terms of braided essays, but it doesn't have to be an essay. It could be book-length work. So a braid, as I'm sure you know, is this sort of style of hair where you take, one piece and another piece and you sort of loop them together to form this braid. So just like that, in a braided narrative, you have maybe 2 elements, maybe 3 elements, maybe 4 elements that you weave together, right? Maybe you have discrete sections for each of them and you alternate, or maybe it's more fluid and you sort of go between themes. But either way, the goal of a braided narrative is one that through the introduction of seemingly disparate things that may at first, the connection may at first be unclear, creates some tension in the mind of the reader, right? They're thinking, what is the relationship between these 2 things? Why is the author mentioning these, 2 or 3 things together? What is the connection? I want to keep reading to see. Another thing is that they might illuminate each other in an intriguing way, right? Maybe you're writing about the connection between science and music, for example, and there's a real connection between these things, and juxtaposing the different elements is actually really illuminating. So one quite famous example of a braided essay is an essay by Joanne Beard that appeared in the New Yorker called The Fourth State of Matter. So in this essay, she is braiding together a couple of elements. She's talking about her work at a physics lab. The title is a reference to some of the work that her colleagues are doing at this physics lab. They research plasma, which is the fourth state of matter. It talks about her divorce. She was going through a divorce at the time. And her dogs were dying. She's talking about accepting the death of her dogs. I should say that when I lay it out like that, it sounds like, okay, it's, it maybe a bit of a common story about some trials that people face in their life. That is because I'm trying to avoid basically a massive spoiler. There is a shock in the middle of the story that is like really incredible. I really encourage you to read it. And as I said, I'll share the links at the end. It's a really intriguing piece. So I want to read this part that occurs towards the end of the essay, and I think here you can without spoiling it, see some of the threads, as it were, coming together. So she's talking about she's sitting at home with her dog, who she's still not been able to bring to the vet to put down, even though it is dying. Okay, so after all the commotion, the living room feels cavernous and dead. A branch scrapes against the house, and for a brief instant, I feel a surge of hope. They might have come back. And I stand at the foot of the stairs, staring into the darkness, listening for the sound of their little squirrel feet. Silence. No matter how much you miss them, they never come back once they're gone. I wake her up here. She's talking about her dog. 3 times between midnight and dawn. She doesn't usually sleep this soundly, but all the chaos and company in the house tonight have made her more tired than usual. The lab wakes. Sorry, she's talking about her dog, not her physics lab. And drowsily begins licking her lower region. She stops and stares at me, trying to make out my face in the dark, then gives up and sleeps. The brown dog is flat on her back with her paws limp, wedged beneath me and the back of the couch. I prop myself up so I'll be able to see when dawn starts to arrive. For now, there are still planets and stars. Above the black branches of a maple is the dog star, Sirius, my personal favorite. The dusty rings of Saturn, Io, Jupiter's moon. When I think I can't bear it for one more minute, I reach down and nudge her gently with my dog arm. She rises slowly, faltering, and stands over me in the darkness. My peer, my colleague. In a few hours, the world will resume itself, but for now, we're in a pocket of silence. We're in the plasma pause, a place of equilibrium, where the forces of the earth meet the forces of the sun. I imagine it as a place of stillness, where the particles of dust stop spinning and hang motionless in deep space. So I think this is, first of all, especially the last paragraph, quite a beautiful piece of writing. But another thing that I really love here is that prior to this, in the essay, she's been sort of talking about these elements in her life quite distinctly, right? She has what's going on at home, where she's not very happy, and what's going on at work. And now they're coming together, right? She's observing the planets and the stars, just like, her colleagues at work who are astrophysicists, study them and, observe them using their scientific equipment, right? And she's talking about her emotional states and the sort of the state of the world, her personal world, using metaphors that she's now drawing from physics. So I think, this piece really is an excellent example of a successful braided essay that doesn't just use different elements for shock, but uses them, or for shock is probably the wrong word, to be a little bit different, but really uses them to be able to have access to different forms of language, different metaphors, and to shed light on one another in, deep and meaningful ways. All right, so another style of braided essay, as I mentioned, is sort of using discrete parts, right? So the last was sort of more fluid. In this piece, which is Parasomnia, it's talking about 2 distinct elements in alternating sections. So the line between them is quite distinct. Within, section A, there's no direct allusion to section B ever, but the connection is quite clear, and you can draw, further connections in your head. So this piece is about different forms of sleep disorders. The author in one section is talking about their family's own issues with sleep disorders. All of the family apparently sleepwalks, quite severely. And so she's reminiscing on her childhood where everyone in their house was constantly sleepwalking. And the other element is she's discussing in sort of a quite clinical and medical way, a particular form of insomnia called fatal familial insomnia, which is deadly. People who suffer from it eventually die from it because they stop being able to sleep completely. So one thing that's interesting here is that whereas in the other piece, the tone between the different strands of the braid was consistent. Here, the tone is quite distinct. The register is quite distinct. So that's another thing that you might consider playing with if you are writing a braided narrative. So I'll just read this section. Once I woke to the slam of a door, Kelsey, I guess their sister, was standing in the middle of the room, wrapped in her comforter, the bottom end trailing behind her and into the door jamb. She leaned forward, tethered by the blanket. Tessa and I watched her walk lazily in place for a moment as we assessed her level of consciousness. We whispered her name, and her unfamiliar body didn't respond. Our whispers became sharp. We shouted desperately until she finally looked up after a pause, and after a pause, burst into tears. And then there's a section break. FFI, fatal familial insomnia, progresses in 4 distinct phases. The first is characterized by sporadic insomnia, panic attacks, and general paranoia. The second by the onset of hallucinations. The third by total inability to sleep and rapid loss of weight. The fourth by dementia, muteness, and eventually death. In 2006, psychologist Joyce Schenkine and neurologist Pascal and Montagna published a case report on a man referred to as DF, who exceeded the average survival time of FFI by almost a year through self-directed treatment. When DF was diagnosed in 2001, he was 10 months into phase 1 of the disease. He bought a motorhome and was determined to travel the United States and complete a novel before phase 4 set in. Whenever he experienced a bout of insomnia, he would stay at a rest stop until he achieved sleep. He memorized strings of numbers and would recite them before allowing himself to get back on the road. He reported being stranded at times with prolonged insomnia, only realizing that days had passed when he looked at the date on a newspaper. So through sort of juxtaposing very different forms of sleep disorders, one, where people sleep too deeply and one where people cannot sleep, this author is sort of able to look at altered states of consciousness in contrasting and very intriguing ways. So the last form of narrative that I want to talk about is something that's called a hermit crab essay. This is a term that was coined pretty recently, I think within the last 20 years. I might be wrong about that, but it's a pretty recent term. So a hermit crab, as you might know, is a type of crab that instead of living in its own shell, it's naked and it has to find, it doesn't have a shell, that's what I mean by naked. It has to find a shell of some other animal, or, in the case of the image on the right, some piece of trash to hide its body in. So in a similar fashion, a hermit crab essay is an essay that takes its form, or its shell, from another existing genre of writing. It could be a menu, it could be, a quiz, it could be, anything out there, and uses that form to tell a story rather than to convey the kind of information that is typically conveyed. So basically, it's taking a non-creative nonfiction form and using it to tell a creative nonfiction story, if you think back to one of the early slides. So this is one famous example. It's by Nancy McCabe. It's called "Can This Troubled Marriage Be Saved? A Quiz." And it takes the form of the kind of questionnaire that you would probably answer if you and your spouse were going to marriage counseling. It's those sorts of sort of generic questions. Rather than just reproducing that, she keeps the actual questions and then replaces the answers with her own story, basically. So, for example, what made you decide to marry him? You don't know, considering that you felt no jealousy, grief, or regret when your distance led him to sleep with an old girlfriend. B, because he proposed, well, the two of you sat in the window of his apartment and bells tolled from a nearby church. The bells lent portent to that moment, made it seem less like your life than a life from a story. Still, you said no. C, when you said no, he promised anything, whatever you wanted, 4 children with biblical names, like you and your first love had planned, a career change, a religious conversion, regular church attendance. But when you still said no, and he sulked in the kitchen and curled up in a nog-hide chair in a circle of lamplight, you pretended his cozy attic apartment was yours, there above the streetlights as they popped on at dusk. And then the next example is by the author who actually coined the term Hermit Crab essay. It's called "We Regret to Inform You." So it takes the shape of a series of rejection letters, the type of rejection letter that an author would get from a literary magazine, for example. So this is just one of them, but it's sort of a series that charts disappointments in her life, starting from this earliest one when her childhood drawing was rejected from being displayed in their school, I think, to later on when she learns that she can't have children. She has various disappointments in her life. So just to read this one. Dear young artist, thank you for your attempt to draw a tree. We appreciate your efforts, especially the way you sat patiently on the sidewalk, gazing at that tree for an hour before setting pen to paper, and the many quick strokes of charcoal you executed with enthusiasm. But your smudges look nothing like a tree. In fact, they look like nothing at all, and the pleasure and pride you take in the work are not enough to redeem it. We are pleased to offer you remedial training in the arts, but we cannot accept your drawing for display. With regrets and best wishes, the art class, Andersville Avenue Elementary School. So I found an interview with the writer about this piece and about essay writing in general. And one of the things that she said is that when she was writing this piece, she wanted to create humor using the contrast between the detached, cold language of this kind of formal, professional rejection letter and the very personal feelings of failure that one would feel as a child, for example, right? So she wanted to create humor using that contrast, how inappropriate this kind of formal language is for this setting. So here, it's a very deliberate use of a form to create a certain emotional effect. One thing I will say about this form, the Hermit Crab essay, is I think it's quite difficult to do well, or put another way, it can be easy to fall into the trap of sort of letting the creativity of the idea be the only thing going, right? So you think, I'm going to write a story that's in the form of a menu, or I'm going to write an essay in the form of, rejection letters. That's wonderful, but right, that can't be the only element. And there has to be some sort of fit, right, between the form that you choose and the content, between the shell and the crab, if we're using that metaphor, right? You don't want it to feel like it's a cage being put on your story and constraining what you can or cannot say. You want it to be illuminating in some way, intriguing in some way, right? So, with the marriage counseling example, I think the fit was very clear, right? These are the kinds of questions that you would ask yourself if you're in a happy marriage. It allows the author to explore the story in a nonlinear fashion and to sort of very directly explore her emotions, right? Whereas, if she decided, okay, I'm going to do it like a menu, for example, well, I don't know what that would really allow her to do. It might be more of a constraint than anything, and it might feel more like an artificial, cutesy idea rather than something that is really illuminating. So it's a really fun format to play with, but I would caution you to think about how you pair the story that you're trying to tell, the narrative, and the form, because the fit has to be logical. So these are sort of all the the themes that I want to talk about. The sort of takeaway message here is I hope that as you're writing or as you're reading, looking at these different forms has maybe made you more appreciative, more conscious of the choices that authors make, because even something as simple as a linear narrative is a choice, right? From there, you can start to ask why the authors made that choice, why they structured their narrative as they did. What emotional effect does it have on the reader, for example? What does it allow them to tell or hide? Does it create suspense, right? Is it jarring in some way? These sorts of things. So as you write your own narratives, I hope that you'll be able to keep some of these experimental forms that we looked at in mind, and maybe try them for yourself. For example, maybe try narrating your day in a couple of different fashions, just as an exercise, and think to yourself, what the effect is of different devices. Lastly, I want to share links to all of the pieces that I excerpted. There are also a couple of extra ones that I added. So one moment while I get those ready. Other than that, I just want to say thank you all for your attention. I hope it was interesting, and I guess I'll just open it up for questions or comments. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to say? Maybe even a recommendation of a favorite essay that is relevant to some of the forms that I was talking about, or any questions at all. No, everybody's very quiet. Well, if not, I do have one more thing to plug. I lied. The last thing I'd like to plug is that the Creative Writing Club does run student workshops. Denise, who is here, has shared her work twice, very generously and very bravely. And I invite you all to consider signing up for one of our open slots. We have an open slot in a couple of weeks, actually. And also to attend these events. I think they're really fun. I hope that they're educational for both the listeners and the writers. So for those of you who haven't attended, one student will sign up and share, a poem or a short story, and then we comment on it, how it made us feel, what we liked, and then what advice we would have for the editing process. So I would just invite you all to consider signing up. And with that, I would just wish you a lovely rest of your evening. And thank you very much for attending this short talk today. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.